I'm talking to Edith Shiro, the author of The Unexpected Gift of Trauma, The Path to Post-Traumatic Growth. And Edith, you and I were talking about that title variation so often, and you landed on this one. So first of all, I love the cover, I love the title, and I loved working with you. So Edith, welcome.
Thank you, Anne. I'm so happy to be talking to you. And this is a conversation that started 3 years ago, I think, around 3 years ago in 2019. So very, very excited to be, talking about this through the process, through the whole, steps to get to here. And yes, the title, The Unexpected Gift of Trauma, I dreamt about it, and then we talked more about it, and then we were moving back and forth, and then it ended up in the original form.
I know, the fact that it came back to what you had wanted at the beginning after all of that process was, I'm like, that's what she wanted in the first place. And everybody is trying to manage it and do something different and trying to make it hooky and all of that. But before we get talking about that 3-year-long process, and it was a 3-year-long process, I want you to tell people what this book is about and who it's for and why it's important right now.
So this book is not just about what trauma is and what emotional, psychological trauma is, but it's what happens after trauma. And that's why I think this is such an important message to get across, is that trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence, that even though this book explains very importantly what trauma is, the types of trauma, collective trauma, some of the epigenetics, intergenerational trauma, really, really, really what it focuses on is how we can have all of these experiences and transform them into possibilities for growth, for reinventing, from breakthroughs, for spiritual awakening, for finding your life purpose. So really, it's hopeful. It's really a book that brings a lot of hope in the midst of so much tragedy and so much difficulty and so much transition that we're going through.
I got to tell you, I learned so much from you. So Edith and I worked on her book proposal together. And during this, I learned so much about myself. First of all, I think that I'm super smart. I think that I understand topics, but I came face to face with my own cognitive dissonance. And one of the things that I did not truly understand when we started the project is what trauma is, because for me, trauma is what happens after you get into a horrible car accident and you lose, all the passengers, or you're in a bombing and you lose your leg. And when you began talking about the different kinds of trauma and how people respond to it and how people incorporate it in their body, it totally woke me up. So can you talk a little bit about those big traumas that most of us, or a lot of us, I don't know most, but a lot of us assume is trauma, and what we're starting to understand now is in fact trauma?
Right. And, that's a question that a lot of people are asking me because of what the book presents and because of the kind of conversations we're having today in our society. Trauma used to be, right, this definition of a very tragic, out of the ordinary experience that overwhelmed the system. And usually that was referred to for soldiers coming out of war, for tragic accidents, for, earthquakes, yes. In the last 20 years, I would say, we've developed also this expanded definition of trauma. And I've definitely have seen that in my own practice every day with my patients, in which trauma is not just the big T trauma, but it's the small T trauma, which is everyday kind of experiences that for the person that is living it is very traumatizing. For example, when a kid is going through bullying in school, that can be pretty traumatizing and it can last for the lifetime. When you're going through a divorce, that can be pretty traumatizing. When you're having microaggressions for being discriminated against, for being rejected, for being ostracized from society, those are traumas too. The ongoing relationship that you have with your mother or with your father that can be very painful, that can be experienced as abandonment or rejection or criticism, can definitely develop into a traumatizing experience. So all of these things are defined not by scientists with books. They're defined by the person that is experiencing them. That's why trauma is subjective, that trauma is relational. It has to do with the relation that you have with yourself, with the other, with the world. You know, when we are in pandemic, and that I call that a collective trauma, maybe for some people it's not so traumatizing, but for other people it's extremely traumatizing, right? Those years of confinement, of uncertainty, of losing a job, or of losing people, or being disconnected, or these are all elements that for some people is very traumatizing. So who am I to say, no, that's not trauma? Yes, it is trauma for the person that is living it. So that's why this expanded definition of trauma is so important.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I saw, by the way, welcome to being an author and having your book on Amazon, because I saw, you know, all of us get negative reviews. Every single author, including Dr. Seuss, will get a negative review. And the one negative review that you have right now is it's a social rant. And it's really in response to your very, very real desire to speak to collective trauma. And I, you know, like when we were putting the proposal together, I'm like, yeah, collective trauma. That's sort of at the end. And, you know, we're going to nip in there. And you were, no, we really, really have to speak to collective trauma. So why did you feel so strongly about that? What in your background, what in your everyday, you know, client interactions, patient interactions made you really want to speak to this topic?
Yeah, and you know, for me, that somebody says it's a social rant, I take it as as a compliment, because I come from a place where, as a clinical psychologist, I see individuals all day long, and I see individuals that are having diagnoses or that are having experiences. And yes, we can talk about the individual's experience, right? And the individual's depression and anxieties and fears and panic attacks and you know, losses and pain. Yes, but my way of thinking, and partly because of maybe my cultural background, and partly because I'm a daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I think also systemically. And I think about the group, and I think about the family, and I think about the collective. My professional training is also systemic, not just psychoanalytic and not just individual. So for me, naturally, to think about the group and to think about the culture, to think about society, you know, it's invariably there, even in the office with when I see even one patient. And interesting, I do want to make the note, and that you are a witness, that I'm talking like this before the pandemic happened. And I'm talking about collective trauma before we know there was going to be a pandemic. So this was 2019. And actually, I wrote about this in 2001. So 25 years, almost 25 years ago. This was the kind of writings and research that I was doing, and I wanted to publish it finally after 20 years, but this is not an idea that occurred to me 5 minutes ago. So that's why I think it's so important to stress that and to put that out there, and to say how important and central is, at least in this book, that we're not just talking about trauma from an individual perspective, but we're talking about it from a collective. And I think that's one of the unique things about this book, that it's really encompassing the social, the cultural, the political, the familiar, you know, the systemic aspect of it.
Yeah, you were essentially on fire, because when you showed up and we started talking, you're like, look, I need this book done last year. This book should have been done, you know, 20 years ago. I should have had this book out in 2002, you know, when I'd written a dissertation on it, and you you had all of these experiences of helping people deal with trauma and helping them not only deal with trauma, but grow beyond it and become the next version of themselves that often was astounding who they would become. So speak to that process, if you would, because, I need this done yesterday. I need, you very much wanted to have a traditional publisher that had the reach that was, that was going to give you the breadth that you were looking for. Talk to me about that, about what that was like to want this done yesterday, and 3 years later, here we are.
Well, you need to find an 𝗲𝗡𝗂𝗍𝗂𝗍 that can listen to you, that can understand you, because otherwise things don't happen. And I don't think without you, Anne, and without your presence and without your listening, this could have happened. So I do want to stress that this is not a project that is done alone, that, you were a fundamental key participation and in a catalyst for this process to happen, and you found the right people for me, and you found the right connections, and you really helped me at the beginning channel some of that fire and some of that desire and some of all those ideas into, okay, Edith, remember, this is a process, let's put it on paper, let's start, organizing it. And I think that's really something that makes all the difference in the world. And I'm super grateful for that. And I think, that's the amazing job that you do.
Thank you. And I love that you say that, because it is, it's teamwork. Most people don't realize that it takes a village to bring a book like this to life. Particularly, I mean, you have been serving patients for a lot of years. Yes, you've done the research. Yes, you've been out in the world and you've been speaking on the topic. Yes, you are an expert on this, but it's not, you're not showing up to the table like somebody who's an entrepreneur who's, been building a list or all of this. I mean, you've been serving. So one of the not challenges, but one of the parameters of working with a psychologist like you is how we shape your expert positioning story. The question in the beginning is always, why should we listen to this woman or this man? Why are we listening to this expert? And one of the parameters is, as a psychologist, you take yourself out of the equation and you serve the patient. So speaking about the professional side of you is easy, but there's a very real personal reason, a personal story behind why you've chosen this work, why you're in this work. Can you speak a little bit about the story and how you shaped the story, where you didn't want to go with it, and how you landed on where we went with your positioning story personally?
Yeah, I'm always reluctant to talk about, my personal, I think it's a professional deformation also, because, that's not something I do in my practice. But I also think it's important to bring forth that personal experience and how you also helped me integrate it into the story of the material that I was bringing, the content. So being growing up with grandparents who were Holocaust survivors, and growing up with grandparents, the other set of grandparents that were refugees from Syria, and growing up in a community that had immigrants from all over the world, and then being an immigrant myself later on in life, and always, I think, I was able to identify and to be aware of traumatic processes and experiences early on in life. And I would see these three groups of people. Some of them were stuck in trauma, were developing post-PTSD, were stagnant and fragmented. Then there was another group of people that were able to recover, that were able to go on with their lives, sort of okay. And then there was another group of people which was always mesmerizing to me, and I was super impressed, that were taking these very horrible, difficult experiences and were transforming that into something amazing, and they were like thriving in life. They were much more like conscious, wise, tuned, appreciative of life. And so I kept wanting to ask the questions like, how come? How is this happening? Why this way and not the other way? What are the elements that are happening to make it this way? So it was a very personal process for my own family and where I coming from, for my own community, and then from my experiences in being, let's say, a Latina in the United States, and being Jewish in a Latin American country, and being white in a, you know, so there was all kinds of mixed experiences going on that would inform also my way of understanding those micro traumas that might not have been like, you know, huge losses, but I also was inheriting, and you and I spoke about that, right, from a epigenetic perspective, right? From that biological ancestral kind of information that I'm carrying in my body, right? Because our bodies are carrying information all the time. And I think that was part of what was happening with me, what is happening with me, that I'm, you know, all this information is being stored in my body from my ancestors. And how do I understand it and process it, and what do I do with it?
I'll tell you, that was another concept. I'd heard the word epigenetics before, but when you started speaking to epigenetics, I was like, yeah, I don't know. And you're like, no, and there's like this research, and here's the research that shows that it shows up in rats. And you told a really fascinating story about one of your patients who had been in a school shooting and survived it, thank God. And that the way he had survived it was probably due to the reflexes that he had inherited from his father. Can you tell a little bit about that story? Because I think, to speak to epigenetics, that story really showcases what you mean by that, or what that is.
That's interesting. I usually don't use that example for epigenetics, but I think you're right. It's a really good way of illustrating it. That kid was a survivor of a school shooting, and it was a little bit of a miracle because he shouldn't have survived, and because he had so many bullets in his body that it was amazing how he was able to sustain that. And part of the understanding of how he did it is because he already came from an experience of survival from his country of origin, him and his parents and his grandparents that were there too. That because they were in this situation of survival, they left their own country and came to the US because they thought it was more protected, that it was more safe, and here they are exposed to you know, to life in these situations. But their ability to survive trauma and their ability to escape and to understand it from a different place, I think was informed by past experiences, you know, not only personal, but ancestral as well. So yeah, I think that's a great example. And I mean, this is a family that has been truly affected by the shooting and continues to affect not just them, but the whole community. And not just the children, the parents, but also the grandparents and the brothers and sisters and the aunts and uncles. I mean, it really is, it affects hundreds of people for one event. And that's something that maybe people don't realize, that the transmission of trauma is not just from generation to generation, but it's also across the board. It's this vertical transmission and this horizontal transmission of trauma. And that's why healing it, acknowledging it, transforming it, transmuting it into something that is more illuminated, that it's more wise, that it's more, you know, like it's more enlightened. It's so important because we're also doing it vertically and we're doing horizontally, you know, so whatever we're doing, we're affecting people around us and we're affecting the next generations.
Wow. So the concept of post-traumatic growth, when I came to the table, it's like, all right, trauma is PTSD. And you're like, no, Anne, listen to me. we'd have these debates. No, Anne, listen to me. You're not getting it. You're not getting it. So, you know, a certain number of people experience PTSD, and there's no, you know, the link that PTSD equals trauma is not the link. But Post-traumatic growth is its own animal. Can you define what it is?
Yeah, so yes, I always ask people, do you know what PTSD is? And everybody says, yes, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then I said, do you know what PTG is? And nobody knows. And that's part of my mission with this book, is for people to know that post-traumatic growth exists. Post-traumatic growth is the positive consequences and outcomes that happen in the face of difficult, tragic, adverse, challenging situations for which the person develops certain attitudes, characteristics, and tools to overcome it and to transform from it, right? So it's the positive consequences and the positive outcome that comes out of very difficult experiences. So it might sound like a contradiction, and that's precisely why people always react to the title, the gift of trauma. How can trauma have a gift? Well, this is precisely why.
And it's also important to say, and you do such a great job in the book, of that because you experience growth doesn't negate what happened to you. It doesn't negate how it affected your life and the horror associated with it. So it's not, they're two separate things, that you can experience all of that and suffer those consequences. But the word suffering is the interesting part, because you can become somebody very different and very, it's not heroic as much as you can become somebody so much stronger or so much more evolved than
yeah. I mean, it's like the hero's journey. You don't have to be a hero to go through this, but you do have to have a lot of courage to want to enter this process that can be very dark at times, that can require for you to be face to face with your monsters and for your difficult times and for your emotions and experiences that you might have been avoiding all your life. And it does require a lot of strength and courage to do that and to radically accept that. And then that takes you, if you do that work, that takes you to a place where so much understanding of yourself and of others, and so much appreciation, and I think so much more meaningful relationships with yourself, with others. I also talk about what I've seen with my patients also. It's that this spiritual awakening. There's something about that connection, and I don't mean religious at all. It's more like a understanding, a connection with something bigger than yourself, with a higher being, with like nature, with the universe, that we're all interconnected. I think that's really more the sense that you're not really alone, and that you're not really a fragment, but you're an interconnection of a network of beings in this planet, and the responsibility that means, and also the role that you play in it. I think that's a beautiful thing that comes out of this process. And I always say to people, yes, you can do psychedelics too, and you're going to get there with psychedelics as well. And you can use any other technique. I mean, you want to do yoga, you want to do psychoanalysis, you want to do IFS, you want to do EMDR. I mean, there's whatever you want to use. There's no one way of getting there. I also make that very clear in the book. There's a whole range of, techniques, ways, and, that you can get to post-traumatic growth, but do it, use it, let's
talk about that, entering into the dark place. And I think of deciding that you're going to write a book is kind of like entering into the dark place, that there's so much joy to it. There's so much excitement, but there's also so much frustration. And tell me about if you were speaking to somebody like yourself, who's an expert, who's got this body of work, and who recognizes that people are starting to write about it, and you've got so much that you want to say about it. They're busy. They might be in a practice. They might be serving clients or whatnot. What would you tell them about the process? What should they expect? What are the feelings? What's the timeline? How do they incorporate it into their life? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert because I've only done it once. I've only written one book so far. But things that I've learned, the first thing is like you and I said that this is not a process that you do alone. You definitely want to have people around that support you, amazing people like you, Anne, that really gets it, that are really connected, that really care. Also, I think one of the advice that one of my mentors gave me when I was complaining about how difficult this is at the beginning of this process, he said to me, this is Dr. Auerbach, he said to me, Edith, just find one spot in your house that you're gonna sit there every day. Just make time to be in the same place every day, because things are gonna come to you. They're gonna find you. And that was such a beautiful advice. You don't know. I mean, this is the place where I am now. It's the place that I chose. And it was such a beautiful advice because it brought me back over and over and over, having patience to do it, being open and flexible, to the experience. Um, Not having rigidity with your expectations, knowing that this is going to take longer than what you expect, obviously. It's always like that, and all of you have always told me this. And be very gentle with yourself. I think this is a process that can be very joyful and very beautiful, and you can really enjoy it, and you can get to discover a lot about yourself. I mean, I discovered a lot about myself in this process, and by even talking about it and by sharing it with my mentors, with experts like you, and it really allowed me to question things about myself, to question things about the material, and it only was for more growth. I mean, what happened in these 3 years for me is like it took a life of its own. I came with a material to you, but then it took a life of its own. It's like, wow, it became this other beautiful thing that exists, and I think it can continue. If I would allow it, it would continue. So
Yeah, so much for growth, because that whole process grows you into somebody else, and it does give you, the author, so much clarity. I know you are a very busy psychotherapist, and I just want to thank you for spending the time with us and talking about the process and talking about your book. And so here's the call to action. You definitely want to buy this book. You want to get to know Edith and her work. Edith, will you show it to us? Unexpected Gift of Trauma. It's a beautiful cover and wonderful, wonderful concept and practices that you can take to recover and grow from trauma. So thank you.
thank you, and thank you, thank you, thank you. And for everybody that is listening to this, do not hesitate to contact Anne. And by the way, she didn't tell me to say this, but I want to say it, that, having Anne on your side and working with Anne Shivani really makes a difference. And I really appreciate the work that you do, Anne, and the heart and the passion that you put into it. And that really makes a big difference for anybody that wants to write a book. So thank you. I really mean it. Thank you.